and welcome to our today's coffee and consulting event. I hope you all have your coffee in front of you and have time for the next 30 minutes to listen to a bit what we say about cross-border work trips and the red flags or the things you may have to look at. My name is Friederike Ruch, and I have the honor to do the coffee and consulting event today. This is actually also one of the events where we do now a season of it. So today's topic, or today's destination, better to say, is Switzerland, and you will see in the next couple of months we always will have a different destination, and will therefore then look at the red flags regarding cross-border work trips to those countries. Before we start, on the right-hand side, you will find on the bottom the files or the slides to download. So if you want, please download them while the presentation is online. And as well, and that is I would say, the more important part for the moment, because the documentation you can also then afterwards see on YouTube, because it will be recorded. But on the right hand side as well, there is a box where you can ask all your questions. So any kind of questions you have and will now maybe arise during the next couple of minutes, please do write them down in that box, and I will answer after the presentation, which will take about 30 minutes. I will answer all your questions you have asked until then directly, immediately. So all of the other participants can also hear it and can know the input. Otherwise, if there won't be enough time for it, then we will write an email with the answer afterwards. We have realized, and that is also the reason why we started with that kind of season for cross-border work trips, that if as a company you send people abroad, there are a couple of things usually which you don't know, and also maybe if you look then online what kind of information there's around, there is a bit of a confusion in the end about the different information you can find, and then sometimes decisions are taken based on the information you found on the internet, and maybe also asking the one or the other person, sometimes even just in the company, and then a situation may arise which is not completely compliant then in the country of destination, and then there might be already a couple of issues. What we also thought, because we saw that in Switzerland as well as in lots of other countries, the situation when having people working there just for a really short period of time, for those kind of business trips or short project works, that labor market inspections and the increase of authorities looking really at all the information and details are increasing. And therefore, we thought that might be good just to kind of remind you as well that this is something you definitely should look at in your company a bit closer, because the authorities are starting to look more and more about those cross-border work trips. And usually what we also see that is those cross-border work trips, those short cross-border work trips, usually there is not really the HR not really involved or only partially involved. The business is doing something, but there's not really a real process in the company behind it, and therefore those confusing situation arises, or those situations where people are not fully compliantly working in the other country. Now, what kind of aspect or what kind of steps or things or matters have to be looked at when you send people on a short trip to another country? And this is something which you will see in all the other destinations where we will kind of fly to in the next couple of months. There are similar ones. There, in each country, you will have maybe the one or the other specific matter to look at, or the authorities are more keen to see and question about. But in principle, it is about the immigration part. So you always have to look at whether there is a business visa required or a work permit. And this is, I would say, for Switzerland, the biggest part. If people will be sent to Switzerland to be here, the immigration part takes the bigger or the biggest step. You really have to take care. And if don't, then the authority are really increasing the labor market inspections, and we will come to that in a second. And this is then can end up in not quite easy and good situations. They are also much stricter today, with companies being then banned or on the kind of blacklist, that they are for a certain period are not able to render any services to Switzerland, because they really see that a lot of companies or a lot of employees coming here to Switzerland are not really being compliantly working in Switzerland. So the immigration part is really the biggest part we have to look at in Switzerland. In the next few sessions, then in the next few months, you will see when we look at other countries that might be different. Taxes, we will look a bit to that as well, but that is for those short-term cross-border work trips. Usually not that big issue. Social Security is, I would say, the least we have to really look at. It's more or less just looking at being or having the formalities in line, which means the A1 or the COC, and that is then basically kind of dealt with. Labor law and compensation, that is something in Switzerland also quite a hot topic, because Swiss salary level is quite high compared to other countries. And this is something, if there is a labor market inspection, then it is basically usually about having the right work permit as well as having paid the right salary. Travel entry requirements, it's mostly what we have to look at if someone doesn't need to have a work permit, but needs to have a visa, like the Schengen visa, for example. They're really to look at the rule about only spending maximum 90 days in the Schengen area within any 180 days period. That is something where really everybody has to look at, because there, the customs, when they clear customs and enter Switzerland, they look quite closely at that. And if somebody has overstepped those 90 days, they will not even be allowed to enter Switzerland. They will be just sent back in the next plane to wherever they came from. That is really also something you have to look at. But that is with all the other Schengen member states. they're the same situation. Compliance and processes, that's just as a general side note, I would say. Usually what we see is that companies not really have a process in line, and I think it might be good to think about it, as well as to try to define a process, as well as try to see how can we track all our cross-border work trips from those employees, to see about all the formalities, also the risk, to make an assessment in case there's something coming up then later on as well. So I think there is a lot of things you have to look at, like as well if you send someone on a short-term assignment or a long-term assignment. With those cross-border trips, it's much quicker, usually, the decision taken that someone should go from one country to the other country, and therefore you don't have to really can look at a process which takes you a couple of days. But I think it would be good to have a look at in each company to see whether there's not a possibility to kind of also streamline everything, which makes it also then easier for everybody. We are now in the destination of Switzerland, and therefore, as said, the immigration part is the bigger portion we have to look at and be careful if we send people to Switzerland. And there's also the first thing which we see is whether actually a work permit is required, or whether there's no work permit at all required. And for those cross-border work trips, the question is whether whatever the individual is doing in Switzerland, whether that actually is work, or whether we call it just as no work, and therefore no work permit is required. On the right-hand side, in that brownish, goldish brownish box, you see the definition from the Swiss law, which basically says that any performance or any work which is, I call it, which any active work somebody is doing in Switzerland, that is really being work based on the law, and therefore a work permit is required. We have put down a couple of points in the table to make it maybe a bit easier for you to whether a permit or not a permit is required. So for example, for just having training or attending a workshop where you don't really, you just kind of listen and you don't really be involved, and you are not also one of the person who is running the workshop, then no work permit is required. In case, and that is now depending on your nationality, you would need a visa for coming to Switzerland, then the Schengen visa would need to be applied. Whereas if you are really have to go to a client, for example, to work at the client site, then definitely a work permit is required. And then we have two possibilities: either the notification process we usually use in the EU member states or EFTA member states, that is also called the posted worker notification, so it's basically the same. Or we usually try to do the 120 days work permit in case somebody needs to come a bit regular to, or more regular to Switzerland, because the notification process has a couple of negative aspects, like there is only 90 days you can use that in a calendar year for the total staff. We will look at that as well in a second. So that are those two options. And then there is one positive side effect to it. So in case we now have decided someone actually will work in Switzerland, but maybe he's only coming for 6 days, we then have to see that there is an 8 days exemption rule. And if we look at that 8 days exemption rule, there is maybe the possibility to actually not having to request a work permit at all. Now, the 8 days exemption rule is a bit tricky because you need to determine where the employee is employed with. So if the employee is employed with, for example, with an entity in the US, which is outside of the EU EFTA, and it's not the UK, so if the employer is a US entity, for example, then any person, any employee who will be sent from that US legal entity to Switzerland can work here in Switzerland for up to 8 calendar days in a calendar year without the need of a work permit. In case now the employer is situated in one of the EU EFTA member states or in the UK, then you can't just look at the 8 days per employee. You also have to look at 8 days per employer, meaning if the employee, for example, will only work for 4 days in Switzerland, but the employer, for example, German legal entity, has already sent for 10 days in that year employees to Switzerland to work, then the 8 days are spent, so to speak, and therefore a work permit or a notification needs to be required. So basically those two things you have always to look at, and the key criteria is where the employer is situated. And only at the second step you will look at the nationality of the employee. Online notification, that is something you usually would think of might be the best option for someone being sent to Switzerland to work here for such a cross-border work trip. It is certainly the easiest way. However, in practice, there are also a couple of things we have to look at which might become a bit tricky. And one thing is you have to always request 8 days beforehand, before someone is working in Switzerland. You have to do the notification of that work trip in Switzerland. And it's also that you will indicate the specific days where someone is working. So in our example on the right-hand side, there's that German employee. He shall be working from the 1st of October till the 10th of October in Geneva at a client site. If he in the last minute decides, the 1st of October might be good, but actually I should also already be there on the 30th of September, and he only realizes it at the 28th of September that he actually should already be there on the 30th and work there, then you would need to go back to that employee and say, I'm sorry, we will not be able to do to request the work permit for that day because you indicated you only need to work from the 1st of October and we need 8 days in advance to do the notification. In case you now say, okay, good, if that's not possible, then I do want to do work as well on the 11th of October, you can tell him that is good, but you need to do another notification. If you compare that now to a 120 days permit, then with the 120 days permit, yes, it's a full application you will have to file. and there will be governmental charters. You will have to look at a couple of other things as well, but the employee would be able to decide on its own, just on business needs, whether he has to go on the 1st of October or on the 11th of October or whenever. So within that period, you have that 120 days work permit. The individual, the employee can flexibly say and go to Switzerland whenever it is he needs or she needs. So that is the difference to the 120 days work permit, where I think for someone coming to Switzerland more regularly, or there is a certain contract in place with the client where you definitely know he will go back and forth a couple of times, and before each time reminding the employee to say, you definitely have to tell us before you return to Switzerland, it might be easier. Now, the notification process is quite straightforward. You just have to not make the notification online. You indicate everything there. You don't need the contract with the client. If the employee works at the client side, you don't need a justification. It's quite simple and straightforward. The one thing I would like to point out is that in case the employee needs to work on a Saturday or Sunday, then a work permit, or not a work permit, but a separate permit is required for this. And that depends a bit on the canton the individual is working. Unfortunately, for all the cantons we don't have one straightforward answer and regulation. It's kind of for every canton a different regulation. Therefore, check that beforehand and keep in mind that that also might take a couple of weeks until the authority then approves that as well. From the authority side usually says you should first use the online notification procedure, and only afterwards, if you have used up all those 90 days you have as an employer, you should do the 120 days work permit. Now, the different canton and different authorities have also realized that sometimes just having those 90 days is you're quite limited. I mean, if you have an entity which has 600, 700 people, and you maybe are just on the border, and you have a legal entity in Switzerland as well, so and you work, both of the entities work together, then there might be already a couple of times people go from one place to the other place or meet in Switzerland to work on a project. And as well as with if you have contracts here in Switzerland for clients and you need to have multiple employees in Switzerland, then as well you're quite soon have limit or have used up those 90 days. And they are per calendar year. It doesn't matter how big the legal entity is. It's just those 90 days and not more. The 120 days work permit, I already said a couple of sentences to it. It's the negative part basically is you definitely have to file a work permit application for it. You, depending a bit on the canton, there are cantons you also have then to say exactly when those individuals will work and have a justification why the 120 days work permit is required. Also, there are different treatments how those 120 days will be calculated, and there are kind of three different ways. One is it can be calculated in one turn, it can be calculated in a calendar year, or in a 12-month period. So it depends a bit on the canton and what the situation really is. But if you at some point have requested that 120 days permit, for example, for a 12-month period, then it is in that 12-month period the individual can come to Switzerland as many times as he wants or needs to work here. He just needs to kind of look at those 120 days and see that they are not exceeding. So that might be a very good option for cross-border work trips where someone has to come quite often to Switzerland. In regard to those cross-border trips, work trips, there is that Posted Workers Act in Switzerland as well, which we have to look at, and where the purpose is basically to avoid wage and social dumping and to avoid that someone is working in Switzerland without considering the Swiss labor market conditions. Now, one big point is usually the remuneration. So basically the base salary, which needs to be equivalent to the one in Switzerland. And there, with also having quite a strong Swiss franc, it is sometimes there are quite hefty additional payments to be made just for someone working in Switzerland. The working hours and rest periods have to be considered. This we have seen for employees being on a project work or maintenance work being sent to Switzerland, that they sometimes don't look really at the rest periods. And this is something which if a labor market inspections will look at it, they will fine for that. Minimum length of holidays is usually not really a big issue because Switzerland, we don't have that much holidays compared to the other countries. Therefore, there's usually not really a bigger thing. But it also has to be considered in the end when calculating the Swiss equivalent salary. Also, where there is an indication about night and Sunday work, and that, as I said before, this we have seen that if there is then in the end a labor market control and it comes up that someone had worked in the night or Saturday or Sunday without the proper permit, then that usually is quite heftily be fined. So there, please be very careful. The Swiss salary calculation, we will see on the next slide. There are a couple of different calculators. The one which is shown here is for Zurich, for example. They use it here, and you will put in a couple of information, and then basically you get the information what someone with that profile would actually earn in Switzerland. And on that slide, you will see, as in the lower quartile, that individual would earn in Switzerland 12,958 Swiss francs, and the median is 14,783 Swiss francs. Those two figures are the ones you actually have to look at. The lower quartile, the salary indicated there, that is relevant for any kind of online notifications, and the median is the equivalent salary you have to look at for any 120 days permit or any other type of permit you will request. So those two are relevant, and it doesn't matter whether the employee for whom you will request the work permit is female or male. It's always the upper line you have to, oh no, sorry, the lower line you have to look at. So basically it's the 14,393 Swiss francs as well as the 16,420 Swiss francs you have to look at. You always have to look at the male part, not at the female level. And at the next slide, we have tried to run a calculation to show you what in the end the employee is entitled per day. Looking at that, if you have someone coming to Switzerland, for example, for 10 days, then you don't need to pay him the full monthly salary in addition. You will have to just pay him the Swiss equivalent salary just for the work days he had been working in Switzerland. And that means physically working in Switzerland. If the employee had been working those 10 days, then basically the difference of the salary he receives compared with the salary he should have received, so the Swiss equivalent salary, will be divided by 21.66 days. That is an average number of days we look at per month, and then multiplied by the 10 days or by the days someone had been working in Switzerland, which gives then the amount the employee should receive in addition to the salary he had already received. And with that, you will be compliant based on Swiss law. What the labor market inspections or labor market controls usually look at is that that amount had been really paid. Now, it's not that if someone had just come back and has provided you the information that they had been for 10 days in Switzerland, that just the next day you need to already have paid it. You just have to kind of a process like once the employee has provided the information within the next salary run, you will actually add it up, or every quarter you actually look at all the days someone had spent in another country or in Switzerland, and then we'll do the additional payments. There just needs to be a process, and then the authority is fine with it. And that also brings us to the next point, to those labor market controls, which are really increasing. And we had now, with a couple of clients, those labor market controls. Now, they are not always in the office, in person. Sometimes they are also in writing. The thing is, if they are in person, and if those labor market officials are coming to the office, then they will ask for the employee or for the individual, and usually nobody else is allowed to be around. This also means that if the labor market inspector then asks the individual, actually, what are you doing here? And the employee says, oh, I'm working, then it's done. Then they will ask, the next question is then, where's the work permit? So in case the individual said before they went to Switzerland, oh, I just will basically participate in a workshop and I will not really do anything. And based on that information, you may have not requested any work permit because your understanding was the individual will not work in Switzerland, and therefore nothing is required. Now, the thing is, if the individual in the end provided the labor market inspector a different answer, or just honestly answered, or maybe also the plan has changed and he is now working but forgot to inform you beforehand, then you can't actually change that again. So whatever kind of information was provided to the labor market inspector by the individual is actually kind of set in the end. And that will then also be the basis for anything coming in addition. And usually what they are looking at is really, is the work permit there? Is the equivalent Swiss salary being paid? Is for food, lodging as well, travel, is that paid as well? Are work hours being in line, as well as not having worked on a bank holiday or on a Sunday? That is what they are looking at. There are a couple of cantons which also look in the end at the A1, that, or the COC, whatever is required, that they do want to see that as well. As said, that is something, therefore, you should really look at quite closely and see whether you have everything in line and everything is good in your company in that regard. To tackle for the next couple of minutes just the other topic, which is the tax topic. In principle, those cross-border trips, work trips we are looking here are, it's just for a couple of days or a couple of weeks in one turn, and then usually the employee goes back. So there is no change of employer. They usually stay less than 180 days in Switzerland. Usually there is no compensation paid in Switzerland. Usually there's also no cost coverage in Switzerland, meaning that the Swiss permanent establishment or Swiss legal entity will actually cover the cost because it would have been charged to that. Usually the cost and everything will remain in the country they are employed with. If we look at that, then usually there's no problem at all. Now, if someone is actually sent to work in a legal entity or permanent establishment of the same firm, then you always have to look at as well at the factual employer principle. And that is something you really should look quite closely, because if that's the case, then there is taxateurs. Taxateurs requirements are, and then basically from the first day on, that individual has to pay Swiss taxes. Now, usually the payment of Swiss taxes is not really a big issue because it's usually also the lower tax liability, but the whole administration, which you have to look at in the background, meaning you have to exempt those days then in the home country from taxation, and to see how you kind of administer or how you kind of pay the taxes in Switzerland. That is the kind of bigger issue. If there is no Swiss employer and there is no taxateurs, that the only thing is really then to see whether someone has in the end spent more than those 183 days in Switzerland. If so, then the tax payments will be done through the through tax filing. And that is also that next slide here, saying that basically if one of those 4 conditions are met, and it's sufficient if just one is met, then the tax liability starts from the first day. What we sometimes see, not that much maybe in Switzerland, but in other countries, that individuals have spent a couple of weeks on holiday in that country as well. And those days are counting as well. So if we look at Switzerland, where we look at a 12 months period, or better to say for the full calendar year, and if someone had been in the beginning of the year, maybe in the ski season, being for skiing here in Switzerland, and then later during the year, the individual had been working in Switzerland, all the days stayed in Switzerland, and there also the weekends will be counting towards those 183 days. And therefore, it's quite important that the individual will fill out a calendar to see that he really has not exceeded those 183 days, or better, that you can kind of work with that to see that you definitely stay below those 183 days. So to kind of sum it up, or better to say, our red flags for Switzerland are really requirements of work and not work permit or notification. Make sure you have either have looked at that and have made your assessment on it. You pay the Swiss equivalent salary for someone working in Switzerland. See that you get the right numbers and to see that you definitely have everything in line. Saturday and Sunday permit. If your employees have to work, then check out whether there is an additional requirement to get those permits and then also request it. Labor market inspections. Be aware that those are increasing, and prepare your employee as well that whatever he basically has told you, that he will tell the same thing to the labor market inspector. Mandatory Swiss labor market conditions, there's just in addition the breaks, vacation, bank holidays to look at. From a tax point of view, make the assessment whether a tax at Swiss application will be or has to be made or is relevant, as well as see that you look at those 183 days and see how you that you can calculate it in a right way. And then we recommend that you always see to get an A1 or a COC when someone being sent to Switzerland, and try to do that as soon as you know that someone will come to Switzerland. At latest, when you definitely know that you have to do either a notification or work permit, because then it's also that there might be a labor market inspections and therefore they might request that in addition. So that's basically from our point of view where you have to be careful and look at for work trips to Switzerland. Our next destination will be in September. We will go to Germany, and in October we actually will go to Austria. And then the next couple of countries are not set yet, but there will be coming one in November as well as one in December, where we go to a different country. In case you, from your point of view, there's a country you are very much interested in, then just let us know and we will see whether we can look at that as well. So now I just try to encourage you again, in case you have any other question or any further questions, or might like to have a clarification, then just write it down in the question box so that I can answer it now, because now it would be time for a couple of minutes we just have left for answering any questions. The first question I have is, how does Swiss companies manage the online notification process? In a big company, it is not possible to know that employees come to Switzerland on a business trip. The chances are high that a company is not compliant. Usually what we advise is that either you define one central place or one central position which actually does it, and encourage then really everybody to use that central department or that central person who does all the notifications, or also and that should not be really in Switzerland maybe, but maybe outside of Switzerland in the country the employees are going to. And you will have to communicate it very often to all the businesses to say, in case you will not request or do the online notification, or don't request the proper work permit, we will getting in trouble. And therefore, it's just really make them aware that that is a requirement at some point, and that, I have to be honest, it takes not just a couple of emails you send across, it takes a bit more, and you need constantly to make them aware that that is a requirement which cannot just be neglected. They really have to look at it, and then at some point you will see that they get aware, there is an awareness, and there will also be then people really asking more questions, and in the end you will have it that you might have for all your people coming to Switzerland have the proper work and notification process. I think if you have a compliance rate in that regard of 95%, you're super, because it is what you say is correct. There are lots of last minute decisions taken, and it's then quite easily you just go from one country to the other country without any problems, and therefore the last thing you usually think about is the work permit. So really the biggest recommendation in that regard is try to make them aware of it. The next question, and there we have actually a couple of questions which are quite similar, is in regard to the tax liability. Whether a calendar should be requested for each employee with holidays listed as well, or how you should do that kind of calculation. We advise and recommend that for any person who you have sending abroad to work trips, and that is not just for Switzerland only, but for other countries as well. And you will need to check then for each country whether those 183 days are met or not met. Therefore, for employees who will have to work internationally and will travel quite frequently, we advise that you usually get a travel calendar, and that is just a normal calendar you can use, where they fill out each day where they had been. Sometimes you can also use your internal reporting system where they have to report their time, and maybe out of that you can see already where they have to indicate the country where they are working or where they are, and then just use that. Otherwise, you can use a normal calendar. They have to fill out for each day really in which country they have been working as well as been staying, in order to determine the tax liability. And then if you use it with Excel, for example, or there are other models as well, you can maybe also run then make an automation for the calculation for each country, that you can see in the end how many days someone has been spending in the various countries. Sometimes it's just to make the employees aware. We usually advise, if you know employees are working on international projects or have teams all over the world, then provide them with the travel calendar already in the beginning of the year. And then sometimes as well to tell them they should send them back to you every quarter for a review, because then you can also react on it and just need to wait in the end or have a result in the end. You just need to act on it. Rather try to get upfront some information so you have sufficient time to make amendments and react accordingly. The next question is about whether in the other EU EFTA countries have also a notification system. And yes, that is correct. That is that posted worker notification you may have heard already, and which we will be looking at in our next two countries at least, with Germany and Austria. Austria is, for example, one of the countries. They are really very, very picky, and you will see that in the other countries there are much stricter rules and regulations. It's a bit easier because you don't have those 8 days in advance notification process, so you can usually just do the request a day before someone has to start to work, but still you will have to do that, and there are a couple of other things attached to it. I think I have answered with that now all the questions, because there have been a couple of other questions, but I think they are just similar to the one I have answered. I made my answers now. In case I forgot something or you would like to have any other questions, then just as said, you can drop us an email and then we will get back to you. I hope you enjoyed the coffee and consulting event and our destination of Switzerland for this time. I also just like to use the next 1 minute to just tell you what you can expect as well from us in the next, otherwise from us in the next few weeks. One is the next webinar we have is about the challenges for cross-border employment between Switzerland and Germany. That will be on the 29th of August, in case you are interested in that. As well as we have on the 3rd of October our next half-day seminar about remote work and vacation, basically from labor law to payments, everything included. And last but not least, the next webinar, next coffee and consulting event on the 11th of September about the destination of Germany. I hope you liked today, you enjoyed it, and I wish you a great lunch and a great week. Thank you for your attention.